Jira Basics, Module 4, Workflow and Status. In this module, Module 4 in our 7-module course, we're going to be covering and looking at workflow and status values in the process of creating and working with Jira issues. In the previous 3 modules, we looked at installing Jira, the concept of projects, and labeling and prioritizing those issues. And in the subsequent modules, we're going to look at versions and components and dashboards and searching for those issues. But in this module, we'll focus solely on workflow and status values. The learning objectives for this module: 1. Understand what workflow is. 2. Understand what an issue's status represents. 3. See how we display that configured workflow for a particular project. 4. Understand what a workflow scheme is. And 5. We're going to walk through a Jira issue, going through the different workflow stages and status values. First then, what is workflow and what are status values? Well, every Jira issue you create will have a status value, and that status is typically something like to do, in progress, done, and there's a concept of moving between those status values and the path it follows through those status values, which is termed the workflow. So in this particular example for this Jira issue, in this Jira project, we have status values of to do, in progress and done, and this issue can follow a path through that workflow where we go to do, in progress, done, or we go back to do, or we go back to in progress, and the various paths. So if we're considering workflow and what a workflow is, it's made up of 2 components: the states or the status values, to do, in progress and done, and the transitions between those states. In fact, that's the usual starting point for status values in a Kanban agile project, so it's not a bad place to start, but you'll see we'll be able to add different status values, be able to add to that workflow and the paths the Jira issue can take as we configure our Jira projects. But when we're talking about workflow, we're referring to those transitions and the path we take between those status values, and that's the important concept to grasp. So in Jira we can configure these status values and the allowed transitions, and we'll want to configure those so that they make sense in the way that it works for your projects and your real life workflow and issue statuses. So let's look at a practical example of this. We'll walk through the creation of an issue and moving that issue through the workflow, transitioning the issues through the different status values as we go. So we're back to the initial Jira training setup we created in Module 1, and from here we can create a new Jira issue, and we have our Acme delivery system, Acme accounting system projects that we set up in previous modules too. And if we create a new issue for our Acme delivery system, and we call that, the summary, another issue, and we scroll down, add some description, and we may assign it to somebody, to ourselves, and set priority and labels, which we've talked about in previous modules. But when we create that issue is given an initial starting status. And that initial starting status value in this project's configuration is the to-do status. And there's a particular field with a particular value for every Jira issue in your system, and that is set initially when you create a Jira issue to do. There's a handy link next to that status value so you can view the workflow that applies to this particular project. And for our ADS, our Acme delivery system project, we've set this up so that it covers that Kanban approach of just to do, in progress and done. About as basic as you can get to start with. Between those different status values, you'll find there's some buttons across the top, and these buttons change depending on the workflow you configured, and you can either click on the start progress, in which case transition to in progress, or we can click on done, in which case we transition to the done status. So I'll click on start progress, and we can see that the issue has transitioned from to do to in progress. I can click on done, and then we transition from in progress to done. Nothing too complicated there. But as we add more status values, the complexity of that workflow and the paths between those different values can start to increase. And the more complex the workflow brings more benefits in terms of tracking the detail and modeling your more complex, that real world workflows. And that's what it comes down to. We're just trying to model the real world complexity, and Jira is configured so that it fits and matches that real world workflow and status that you take all of your work tasks through in the real world. So bear in mind there's a trade-off here. The simpler you make that workflow and the fewer status values, the easier it is to understand and work with Jira. But the trade-off there is that workflow and status value may not model your real world environment, and you may need to add status and workflow values. So how do we configure those workflow and status values? Well, when you create a new project, there are what we call some new or standard workflow schemes that you can select from. So if, for example, we select a project management type project, click Next, the default workflow scheme that's applied to this type of project is to do, in progress and done. If we go back and maybe we select a basic software development type project, then you'll see there's a slightly more complex workflow and additional status values to do, in progress, review and done. If we go back and select a process management project, that complexity increases even further, and we end up with statuses like open, in progress, under review, rejected, approved, etc. And when we create that project, if we give this a project name, project 1, give it a key, AP1, and submit, and create that project. When we create our first issue in that project, what we'll see is a slightly more complex workflow with additional status values compared to the first project we looked at. Clicking on the workflow view link, and now we can see that the different status values we can transition from are as follows. So when we create the issue, we're in an open state, and from here we have just one option. We can go in this, follow this path, and start progress to go to in progress. Once we're in progress, then we can transition to cancelled, or we can transition to under review. So Jira and the workflow scheme that we apply to a project enforces this workflow and the status values that we have to conform through when we create issues in this project. So that's how we go about applying a workflow to a new project. If you want to change the workflow for a project, you have two options. Jira comes with either inbuilt schemes and you apply a new scheme to that project, or you can configure and modify the existing schemes or create new ones with new workflow, new status. So creating and modifying schemes or workflows we'll cover in a different module, but what I'll show you now is how to apply an already existing scheme to an existing project. So we created our Acme Project 1, we applied a scheme to it, and if you want to change that workflow and status scheme, you can click on Project Settings. You scroll down to the workflow area, select the workflow scheme, and on this page you have the option to switch the scheme. So if we click on Switch Scheme, you can see from the drop down here that we could select the different schemes that were defined when we first created this project. So we could go back to the default scheme, associate that with this project, and in doing so any existing issues will have to be converted over to the new scheme. So you do have to map the status values of existing Jira issues from the old scheme to the new scheme, which is what this screen represents. But we can select the defaults here. We only have one issue, so it's not a big task in this particular instance. We click Associate, and you'll see here that in that migration we had just one issue that was converted across into the new scheme. Acknowledge that. And now if we go back to our project and we look at the issues, and we view that one issue that we created at the start and look at the workflow, we'll see now that the workflow has moved from that complex initial workflow scheme we had back to a slightly simpler workflow scheme. So as I mentioned, what we're focusing on here is applying existing workflow schemes to our projects. If you're a little more adventurous, then you can follow some of the steps in the next part of this module, which takes us through implementing a slightly more advanced workflow. So in this example then, we've applied a new workflow scheme, and that workflow scheme is known as the classic Jira workflow scheme. And now when we're editing or updating or creating new issues, we'll see we have a different set of buttons across the top. We can start progress to move to the in progress status. And then once we're in progress, we can either stop progress or we can move to the resolve issue. And once we're in a resolve status, and you can see as we resolve this issue that this particular workflow scheme is set to enforce some capture of additional information. In this example, it wants some information about how we resolved this. Click on the resolve button, and now this issue will transition to the resolve state once we've selected the resolution value. And the only options we have now are either to close the issue or reopen it and continue work on it. So if we close it, finish it, issue complete. Again, we're enforced to enter a little more detail to complete the close process. And from that, we've taken our initial Jira issue through the whole classic workflow scheme of open, in progress, through to resolved, through to closed. In summary then, there's a lot more to this workflow status and transition than first meets the eye. But as long as you understand the importance of the issue status values, and you can transition your issues through these workflow statuses using the buttons, then you'll get by just fine. The important point is that you need to pick or create a workflow scheme that matches your real world workflow. And in that way, Jira will support and help you manage your work tasks in a more efficient manner. And that completes Module 4, Workflow and Status Values. In Module 5 we'll move on to Versions and Components and see how we can combine the versions and components functionality in Jira to help us further sort, organise and categorise all of our issues within our projects.